We begin in Washington, where the Trump administration is taking legal action against one of the nation's largest cities. The Department of Justice has filed a lawsuit against Los Angeles, alleging the city's so-called sanctuary policies are unconstitutional and actively impede the work of federal immigration authorities. The lawsuit follows a period of significant unrest in Los Angeles earlier this month, marked by protests and riots against operations conducted by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. In an exclusive statement, Attorney General Pam Bondi directly linked the city's policies to the recent turmoil, saying, "Sanctuary policies were the driving cause of the violence, chaos, and attacks on law enforcement." The administration's legal argument centers on the supremacy clause of the Constitution. The lawsuit contends that by restricting ICE's access to detained individuals and information, Los Angeles is discriminating against federal authorities and treating them differently than other law enforcement agencies. The Justice Department is asking a federal judge to block the enforcement of these policies. However, Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass has strongly pushed back against the administration's narrative. Earlier this month, she described ICE's actions, which included operations at schools, emergency rooms, and homeless shelters, as provocative. Mayor Bass argued that the federal government used the subsequent unrest as a pretext to deploy the National Guard and U.S. Marines into the city, an action she called an instigator of further conflict. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, a significant rift is emerging within the Republican Party over President Trump's signature legislative priority, what he calls his One Big Beautiful Bill. The conservative House Freedom Caucus is sounding the alarm over the Senate's version of the massive bill, which combines tax cuts, border security, and an increase in the debt limit. The caucus's primary concern is the bill's impact on the federal deficit. In a public statement, the group argued that the Senate's proposal would add a staggering $1.3 trillion to the deficit. This is in stark contrast to the House-passed version, which they say would increase the deficit by a much smaller $72 billion. Key differences are driving the dispute. The Senate bill adds an extra $1 trillion to raise the debt limit compared to the House version. It also makes permanent certain corporate tax cuts from the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which the House had only extended temporarily. To win over some of its own members, the Senate also added provisions like a $25 billion fund for rural hospitals. However, conservatives in the House remain unconvinced. Representatives Ralph Norman and Eric Burleson, both Freedom Caucus members, have warned that the bill could fail in the lower chamber if it isn't changed. They are pinning their hopes on an amendment from Florida Senator Rick Scott, which would significantly increase the financial burden on states that expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. Burleson stated that without Scott's amendment, which could add hundreds of billions in savings, he doesn't see how the Senate's bill can pass the House. Republicans are using a process called budget reconciliation to advance the bill, which allows them to bypass Democratic opposition with a simple majority vote in the Senate. The goal is to have the legislation on the president's desk by the 4th of July. But this internal party conflict now threatens that timeline. Turning to international trade, talks between the United States and Canada are back on. According to a White House official, negotiations are resuming immediately after Ottawa reversed course on a planned tax that had angered Washington. The issue was Canada's proposed Digital Services Tax, or DST, which would have primarily affected the revenue of major U.S. tech companies. U.S. President Donald Trump had abruptly terminated trade discussions late last week in objection to the tax. In response, on June 29th, the Canadian government announced it would introduce legislation to rescind the DST. Kevin Hassett, director of the Economic Council in the Trump administration, confirmed that talks are absolutely resuming right away. He noted that President Trump had initially requested the tax's removal during his meeting with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at the G7 summit in Canada just a few weeks ago. With the tax now off the table, the path is clear for discussions on a broader trade relationship to continue. The Department of Justice has unveiled what it calls the largest coordinated healthcare fraud takedown in its history. Federal prosecutors announced sweeping charges on Monday against more than 300 defendants across the country, including 25 doctors. The individuals are accused of participating in various schemes that sought to cheat taxpayer-funded programs like Medicare, as well as private insurance, out of a staggering $14.6 billion. One of the most disturbing cases highlighted by the DOJ involves a conspiracy in Arizona. 3 defendants are charged with reaping millions of dollars by providing elderly Medicare recipients with unnecessary skin grafts. According to the indictment, a nurse practitioner applied these grafts, known as amniotic wound allografts, to patients even when they were medically unreasonable and unnecessary. The indictment alleges this was done to terminally ill patients in hospice care, some of whom were just days from dying. Matthew Galliotti, chief of the DOJ's criminal division, described the conduct as callous and disturbing, saying the scheme stripped patients of dignity and peace in their final days. Another major part of the enforcement action, dubbed Operation Gold Rush, resulted in charges against at least 20 members of a transnational criminal organization, including defendants based in Russia. They are accused of a $10 billion Medicare fraud and money laundering operation centered on catheters. In response to the scale of these crimes, the Justice Department is launching a new fusion center to consolidate healthcare data from multiple agencies. Officials are also making a direct plea to the public for help, noting that over half of all whistleblower tips they receive are for healthcare fraud. Finally, the Supreme Court has issued a landmark decision that will change how legal challenges against federal policies are pursued. The court ruled on the controversial practice of nationwide injunctions, which have been used by single federal judges to block government policies across the entire country. The ruling is seen as a victory for the Trump administration, which has seen many of its key policies halted by such injunctions since the president returned to the White House. The primary argument against the practice was that it allowed judges to exceed their authority by granting relief to people not directly involved in the lawsuit before them. For example, injunctions had been used to prevent the administration from limiting birthright citizenship, even for those who hadn't sued. However, the justices indicated that the fight is far from over for those who oppose the administration's policies. While the specific tool of a nationwide injunction has been curtailed, the court's decision leaves open potential workarounds. Plaintiffs, such as states or nonprofit organizations, can still seek broad relief against federal policies through other legal avenues, most notably class action lawsuits. This means that while the legal landscape has shifted, widespread blocks on administrative actions remain a distinct possibility.